Good afternoon to this second session of research methods. I will touch upon a series of ideas, themes, topics that we've been already looking at in the morning sessions, and I've organized them in three areas. I will first very briefly in 3 minutes warm you up to a little bit the framework of the discussion in slightly more conceptual terms than before, sort of setting the scene for design practice research as I see it. Then we will discuss some strategic elements, some method ideas later on, and then we'll go into perhaps something that, just for the sake of this beautiful Calder mobile, I've put here as the third one, into the implementation type of thing. So that's what we'll walk through, run through, or balance through in the next 45, maximum 50 minutes. And then we also should have perhaps a discussion. If you want to jump in at some notion that you pick up that you find interesting, please just put your hand up and we put this to a halt and can obviously discuss also while I make this little presentation. So if we go first into the framework, very briefly, you all are, of course, by now aware that on the one side there is this extraordinary, unique model, which is the RMIT model, which deserves to be championed as it were, a global paradigm in its own right. On the other side, there is, since roughly 15 years, a huge shift going on in theory, in principle, and in general, which is the so-called practice turn in contemporary theory at large. And what's relevant for us is actually the idea, or for design practice research, is that if there is a practice turn in theory, that means that many of the sort of received notions and concepts that have to do with theory, theory making, modeling, cognitive sciences, etc., type of ideas have to be recast. There is a huge practice turn in many other areas going on that almost independently of this, the RMIT model of design practice research has emerged, could show that perhaps RMIT and the model was ahead of its time, but now the rest of the world is, as it were, catching up. Also in other disciplines. So this is relevant from sociology to anthropology and through the sciences as well. So there are paradigm shifts occurring, turns, and one of the turns, as it were in the broader sense, is towards practice, understanding practice and what practice means in cognitive terms, meaning in knowledge terms, in epistemological terms. What can we know through practice is huge. Second, there are three little warm-up ideas. As soon as what we're doing here, you discuss design practice research in methodological terms, in terms of methods and strategies, of course, alarm bells come up, not because the sciences don't know much about methods and have been very rigid about methods. As you know, there are certain methodological, as it were, presumptions and ways to go about research if you're a chemist. But there is also another element to it, which is very important to the way we would look at methods and strategies, namely that what is the worst enemy of science? And Paul Feyerabend, you know this man in California, he wrote the book Against the Coercion of Method, meaning as soon as we discuss methods, they can become very quickly formulaic, they become sort of ready to deliver type of scenarios, and whatever we discuss here in research methods, whether we come to there is an interesting practice, there may be a best practice here, or there may be some interesting result over there, this cannot mean that we already close into a sort of a received set of methods that then become the stock of the research methods in design practice research. That dovetails with a remark that we heard already in the morning, namely part of the research contribution that you might bring to the field would be a contribution to research methods. It would be an insight or perhaps a series of insights into how to conduct this type of research. And that could be shared by your peers. So there is a community of practice that you articulate in through research methods. Yeah, so this is, in a way, yes, against the coercion of methods, just at the same time, we are pressured institutionally, the tertiary sector, of course, to somehow be as explicit as we can about what kinds of methods do we want to apply. Also, we don't want to simply leave people to experiment at the complete, as it were, left on their own. You will see how extensive the pressure and how the pressure here, for example, at RMIT was that with Leon and Richard and others, we had to develop almost a set of notions in order to evidence to the university that what design practice research is doing has, in terms of its strategies, its methodic approach, has the same type of rigor and is equally developed as, say, other sciences. So for that reason, some of the notions and ideas that you have already come across in your PRSs, namely communities of practice, the idea of spatial intelligence, discussing and investigating the spatial intelligence, going into public behaviors, the natural history of the creative individual to analyze that, the new book that deals with cases of differentiation. All these come up now in terms of these are, as it were, design tools that we put forth. This is the way how we feel this is a sensible, this is an interesting, this is a worthwhile way to investigate in this case of PhDs. This slide obviously reiterates what you've just seen, and is only important because where you are now, some of you may be in PRS 1 or 2, others already 3, 4, etc. What this would like to show is that despite the fact that there is something that is maybe called front-loading in terms of research methods, before you investigate, you should have a certain sense of which ways you want to go about doing this type of research. In design practice research, these questions about which tools, which skills are shaping up, they resurface over every single PRS, and in a way it's very interesting to see if, as happens in Europe now regularly, the community of the PRS attendants, or at least half of them, attend those research methods sessions regularly, because we run them differently, there are different presentations, and every time, also through the discussions that we have in research methods, we build up more and more experience and more ideas about how to go about this very stock of possibilities. These are, of course, behind each of these sit possibilities, and each of the candidates will address these possibilities and perhaps also not in the same, with the same prominence in different ways. So there's the specificity idea already behind it as well. In the slide, and something that I think you have been discussing already, and I don't want to go into technicalities with this presentation, is that apart from this kind of articulation into when do research methods become relevant, as you can see, there are some of these that will become relevant rather late, for obvious reasons. The choreography of the presentation is something that you would not necessarily consider already in PRS 1. But as Leon pointed out, for example, it's very interesting to start, for example, at this point, to consider how you start, how you might complete, as we would call it here. Another element of somehow tracking progress and the trajectories is that there are now these milestones. Milestone jargon is RMIT jargon. And we, as you know, we have these kind of default 6 PRSs, and then there sit these milestones, which actually have not necessarily anything to do with these PRSs in their real form, but we try to simply, because the university wants these 3 milestones to occur, we project them into the PRS signal. So you've done milestones, you've done a confirmation milestone, and are perhaps heading towards midpoint, etc. I don't know exactly where you are in your candidature, obviously. Down here then comes an interesting last idea that we'll discuss further on, namely that early on things may come up such as mapping, typologies, categorizations. Then in the mid-phase, there might be some transformation of these kinds of techniques and tools occur. That's also to do with your question, when does the process where you have some sort of mapping done and there is a certain proposition, as you said, and when does the extraction lead into the final phase. And you can see there is a certain, probably also criticality at the end that might investigate and might articulate what these kinds of research methodological insights have been. So this is the context simply, and the leitmotif of my presentation, of course, comes with a question of if design practice research is driven by some kind of reflection, then the question is where and how does this reflection occur? And there is an extraordinary widespread bigotry or bias about reflection, that reflection can only occur if you disengage with what you want to reflect upon. The idea is, as long as you are engaged in the process, you're, as it were, in the midst of it, and there's the heat of the moment, and there is no kind of reflection possible. So that's one of the many biases around it, which leads then to people, yes, for that reason you must somehow step back and let go of the very design process in order to be able to reflect upon it. This very idea of disengaging with the process and with the design practice in order to enable you to reflect upon it is exactly the kind of myth that we want to counter. As you know, design practice research is the exact opposite. It is, in that sense, about this kind of reflection premise, namely, rather than to research yourself out of your practice, how can you research yourself even deeper into your practice? If that's, as it were, somehow the aim that we have, then we have the next, say, half hour for me to warm you up to ideas. How could that possibly be done in meaningful ways and in fruitful ways? Here you have the image of the typical Australian philosopher in reflection mode. That is the very idea of complete disengagement and some kind of meditative posture. The leitmotif to my talk today comes from this very scenario, namely it's similar to the torero that is, as it were, very far away from the bull, and if a torero produces or exhibits some sort of pirouettes with the capa 50 meters away or even only 30 meters away from the bull, that doesn't count as bullfighting at all, and it will end up in any corrida in the world as a disaster. So what we actually need is fighting close to the bull. This is what we actually want. For that reason, of course, this is simply a metaphor, and it triggers sometimes comments about whether the corrida is the right way to, and the bullfighting is the right way to talk about it. But the important aspect of it is how can we, as it were, make a step towards the bull and fight so close to the bull that we're not doing some sort of maneuver that is actually disengaged from what we want to investigate. That is what happens in many other research programs, even if it is design research or it is art research and even art practice research. Very often, through the very research process, the disengagement and the closeness is lost. So the question that, for that reason, we have to look closer is the premise of closeness, shifting the standpoint. What is, now this is one of the, I think, interesting questions for PhD candidates. What might be standing between me and the body of work and what I want to investigate? What is it that, as it were, prevents me from fighting close enough to the bull? And of course, we need to translate this into the right, say, mind space. One of the many answers, or here are 3 or 4 of the many answers that could be given. One you hinted at through the last one, namely there could be some sort of jargon that sits with, for example, selling routines and ways to present it, and they are over-rehearsed, and you're absolutely a virtuoso man to put it out in those terms. This is how I understand it. There may be other more sort of tacit ways when there are biases that you're not aware of. So start to ask yourself, yes, I'm looking at this work and I'm extraordinarily familiar with this work. This is my body of work for the past 20 years, maybe perhaps 30 years, and there's an extraordinary familiarity with it in many ways. What are the potential biases? What are sort of implicit ways to look at it that I'm not aware of? And this is how I tend always to look at it. Maybe they translate even into thinking styles. We had already a discussion about jargon in the morning. Of course, thinking styles articulate very often into the respective jargons. There may be other ways. Cognitive habits basically means ways of thinking and exploring that are so extraordinarily familiar to us, that we have routinized them, and so we jump into them constantly. That, I think, is one of the most important things to explore if you want to meaningful step closer and fight close to the bull, yeah? Rather than reiterate the ways in which you have been perhaps thinking and talking and articulating your work in the past. So, the way then, in terms of the design practice research, would be stepping inside the research laboratory rather than step out of it, which of course means, again, back into the practice and looking at the practice. We'll see, of course, also in a practice over, what do you do with a practice over 10, 20 years of history. I'll just hint at you the interesting question that we might discuss later about there's sometimes a tendency to say, well, the practice has already, the research has already happened because the practice to a certain degree has already happened, and now the idea is simply somehow to excavate what has happened. So the research is somehow shown, is predating what you're doing now, and it's sort of somehow a capturing process. Let's leave that for a discussion, because I think we're there in the nuts and bolts of what are we doing when we go into design practice research, and if we look into also a body of work that may be part of your practice history. If you have that kind of body of work over 10, 20 years, then, or maybe 5, 7 years, and there is an interesting amount of work, then this is a way to look at it that Richard Blythe introduced already perhaps 3 years ago when he was in Denmark, namely to differentiate now between 3 different types of reflection. You may be already very familiar with them, so I'll just run through them very quickly because you might want to know what sits behind them. So reflection on, reflection in, and reflection for means reflection on is basically looking at something from hindsight. You're going, as it were, into your backstory. Then the reflection in is you're looking into the unfolding event, as it were. That's why I call it also a reflection ex eventu. And then there is the reflection that somehow is anticipating and looking forward, reflection for the ex ante reflection. If you translate this into this kind of imagery, there you have reflection on, where in Richard's way to depict it here, you've got the researcher who is looking into already, body of work that is built, for example. Yeah? And so he's reflecting on past items there and starting to perhaps simply, it starts even with putting them all on the table, so to speak, metaphorically speaking, then dealing with them, then somehow orienting oneself in them, and we'll go into ways to do that in a second. Then there is, this is just the way to to illustrate this, here is reflection in. So this is a project that is sort of half in construction, so that's why you get these dotted lines. And here you've got reflection 4, where you've got something that is, as it were, only speculative, or is only an idea, is only in a stage of perhaps not even inception, but starts to appear at the horizon. If you then fold these 3 reflection layers into the theater of practice of a practitioner, then you have here, in at least this kind of perspective, on the runway of your projects, you have those that you would reflect on because they are in the past. You have here ones that you reflect in, which are the ones in the middle, and then there are those that are still far in the future. So that's the reflection 4 type of thing. Okay, that means simply now a way to address what is past, present, and future, and we'll go, when we go into potential implementation and consequences of what can come out of this kind of work, we'll go into ways how you then discuss the dynamics. What happens to these pieces, excuse me, what happens to those pieces that sit here, perhaps in the light of something that is happening here and something that might be a speculative project there. There you might start to have a very interesting story about, and we might talk about the dynamics and shifting dynamics at the forefront. So that's all a very interesting discussion to have about this. I think that's clear. You've all seen this before in some iteration or another, I suspect. You haven't. Okay, so it's still useful? Is this kindergarten pitch, or is this okay? Are you happy with it, or shall we keep going like this? Okay. Then what some candidates have found also useful was to then, if it comes to, okay, we're now into the idea of, let's reflect on, let's reflect in, and let's reflect for, and how do we do it? Yeah, and what could be interesting, useful ways? And of course, there is no way to prescribe a single way. This is how you have to reflect, but there is an idea to suggest, for example, it is important that you become aware that you are putting on the stuff reflective lenses. So that could be useful for you to discuss this with your peers, with your supervisors. What kind of lenses are we using here? Each of these lenses, of course, will have some editing effect. Each of these lenses will extract something and foreground something maybe, and leave out other things. That's exactly what lenses are there for. So the point, of course, is in this type of research to actually now, when you engage with this, to become always, to reach a point where you are constantly explicit about which lenses are you using. You might even call it not only using, but testing. You might put a lens there and see what does that lens extract, given, does it give me something? Of course, the idea then is give us, or give your supervisor, give the PRS peers, and say judges, give them a rationale, for example. I'm using this lens because I have a hunch that that lens might produce this kind of thing. Yeah? Very often you see PRS presentations where people just put out things and there is not a clear understanding what kind of method are they using, and there's nothing wrong with being selective in your lenses, I would say, as long as you make clear what tools you're using. Because then it becomes, despite the fact that it might be your unique lens, in the sense of you're using that lens, you have made clear, this is the lens I use. That is something that another practitioner can instantly understand. That doesn't mean that he adopts that lens, but he can then see what that lens yields in your case. This is how you catapult yourself out of this strange, which I think is completely faulty, this idea that this is some sort of navel-gazing, subjective kind of exercise. Yes, it has to be situated. Yes, it has to be specific. But through the way how you investigate it, you can communicate what kind of operation you've used in order to bring about that kind of result. So you see how in the very process there are many ways how you can objectify your research so that others can share the very research process, including, of course, also the results. So this is something that I also find at least worth mentioning, that just as there is an interesting simile to scientific research where when you chart an avenue and you find a negative result, say a chemist does that in a laboratory, that negative result can be equally important for the scientific community. Don't go that way. It doesn't yield anything. There's something important also about understanding that research also contributions can sit with failure stories. I tried that, and that didn't produce what I expected in my case. If you stage that in interesting ways, I think it's an important research contribution in its own right. So we've got 25 minutes so far. Yeah. Okay, so make your lenses, this is again fighting close to the bull, make your lenses explicit. Not fighting close to the bull would be to leave them somehow implicit and let others do the guesswork, what on earth has been going on in this kind of research, at this kind of research stage. Also that means disclose your hidden premises, very important, very often not understood. What is underlying this kind of thing that produces and may be very productive in the way how you start to talk about it, and you might gain even traction in research terms, but what are the hidden premises in it? I think that's a very, very, that could be an extraordinary contribution of many if they would do this. It has, of course, also a very positive element, namely part of the, as it were, tacit dimension is the idea to bring forth the mental space and including the spatial intelligence out of which you operate. So part of these hidden premises is not, this is not only a polemic task. Yeah, my premises are hidden, and as soon as I disclose it, I realize they are actually biases or useless thinking styles. But no, it can be something that these are very important premises that I didn't understand that they were operating. So it has many sides to it. So it means to discuss and maybe enforce and also critique them.
Could you give an example of those hidden premises?
Well, in terms of the spatial, people have extraordinary, for example, value systems that sit with propositions very often. Yeah? For example, they have, I'm making this up now, yeah? The idea that creativity is, if you are interested in your creative process, that creativity is your individual, as it were, contribution to the world, and that this is an individual capacity that can be enhanced. A very interesting idea. That's it. Why would you think about creativity like that? Or somebody else has a value system around, say, the social dimensions that have to be always catered for, and he isn't fully aware of these kinds of motivations that are sitting there. Many. It can happen at all. Yes.
One example which fits into this category, I think, is very often people say, "I'm not looking at that part of what I do because that's not my practice." So they've got a hidden assumption that there's a whole area of what they do is not.
Fantastic. Yes, that they already execute an extraordinary censorship towards what they are doing, and for that reason they may miss out on something that may reveal aspects that through the other side of their practice cannot be even detected. Yeah? And then it would be very important that the supervisor says, well, it discovers this at some stage and puts it out on the table. Yes, people also have, part of the hidden premises is also how do we stylize ourselves in the way how we want to look at ourselves and how do we want to appear to others. And it's, I mean, I'm not trying now to suggest that this is that we have to have analysis, but the idea is there's many elements to this that have to do with how, as it were, honest and fighting close to the bull is coming to the full, perhaps, of your background rather than being already carefully crafting and constructing a persona, a creative persona, a design persona that may not necessarily be the most interesting one. Not for this exercise, at least. Yeah? Do not get in any way sort of busy about what I've put up here, but as soon as you say, okay, I've got those reflections, say, scenarios on, for, and in, I have a sense of my reflective lenses, I start to see what they go in. So what could be, as it were, territories and dimensions perhaps worth exploring? I've listed here a few, simply to tease you or to warm you up to possibilities, because people have ideas. Yes, you go into your design work and design stages. You might think it's interesting to have one reflective layer and really capture my design processes, or perhaps exemplary processes. Exemplary not in terms of these are the most beautiful, but these are very important in terms of research, in research terms, important ones. Maybe somebody would say, yes, this has, I even have a spiel on how this articulates into creativity at large. We will go into this. I think there's, as one of the most important, of course, premises to uncover is what exactly is the nature of my mastery. That's part of the very idea. People are engaging with this process because they already have an established mastery, a recognized mastery, an esteemed mastery, and now they're interested in understanding at a much more profound level what is actually the nature of this very mastery, to the point of what constitutes a master in my field. And you might say things such as, I've recently come across the most extraordinary example where I said, I can see the master in this, and it had to do with, I can see the restraint. There is, he could have done much more, but I can see where he stopped. And that is a sign of extraordinary mastery. But I'm just making this up because there may be many, many others. And of course, it's the whole mastery topic is huge. I'll run through this very, very quickly only because I had a slide up very early on. Remember when we were talking about those tools? Namely, of course, part of this kind of then how do you, as it were, make this reflection explicit? How do you articulate it? And as soon as you do that, you're in the challenge of there may be a discourse, there is notions, there are concepts, there are whatever. Yeah? This is the very problem that we have about that you asked straight into, namely, when and how can I shed that maybe useless jargon? And how can I get into jargon? If it's not a jargon, but how can I engage in some way that, in some speech, with words and ways to explicate it, which may not be words alone, that brings this to the forth. So, yes, there are categorizations. People in the architectural discipline tend to talk also about typologies. They should probably talk about types rather than typologies. It doesn't matter. So categories, notions, other people start to say, yes, I could start to craft some narratives. There are many others may start to look into certain principles that are at work there. Yeah, people engage with all sorts of sort of experimental ways to start to talk. Here, I think, are 3, 4 guiding principles that are relevant to me or that are important to me, whatever. Having said that, what you, of course, have to do, and we have had Pia and Leon talk about it at length already in the morning, fighting close to the bull. I apologize that this is now almost a replica. For me also means from jargon and generic discourse to the voice. That, again, you could translate really as one of the manifestations of this leitmotif of fighting close to the bull. So one of your contributions could actually be to make clear why and how this voice is the one and only the most adequate voice to bring forth this type of. So maybe there is something that you have to find your own, as it were, of course, not neologisms, but find your very authentic, close to your heart speech about this. rather than the generic discourse. Why? Because if you go into the generic discourse, it's always flooded with other presumptions, and what we have to do with practically every single candidate at some stage is probably to advise him, detox your language. It's charged, and of course you're not fully aware. This is again another element of the hidden premises, what, as it were, what baggage is coming with every single metaphor. That you, in order to show you that this is not just sort of random talk, about, yes, the voice as a sort of a nice little metaphor. You can see here a diagram that Leon, Richard, and others developed. I probably have contributed to it also at some stage. What you have here, simply because it looks perhaps messy, you've got again here the PRSs. By the way, it's the same kind of box that you had very early on. And we'll talk about these in a second, these fantastic traps that supervisors have to be aware of. This is a diagram that was found useful at some stage also for supervisors. So your supervisors could sort of see, all right, here we have certain, say, possibilities, but also certain problems. And here you see something interesting up here. Perhaps after PRS 3 into PRS 4, this very idea is already scripted into the entire trajectory. The voice may start to emerge. This is when you shed, as it were, the more or less useless jargon that you've been, or that maybe you are also very familiar with, or that might execute some pressure on you, and you start to realize, I don't want to talk like that. This is the way how I can talk about this in much more meaningful terms. It then also relates to something that can happen, and perhaps we can discuss this later on, that almost at the same time, very often some sort of crisis appears. That has, by the way, to do with the very idea. That's an interesting category here. You can see here these PRSs that after PRS 3, you may have enough to initiate what I think it was you, Leon, who coined it. A whole rethought is possible at that stage. Then maybe there is something. Okay, we've done it to a certain point. Is there something else here? Are we already exhausting our possibilities, or do we have to rethink the process yet again? And that's when very often other opportunities emerge, or when the really interesting perspective yet to come starts to announce itself. But this is just, and I've in the handout you've got that very diagram, so that you can play around with it and also use it. Of course, this again doesn't mean that you should be overly concerned if you don't have the sense of a crisis. These are not prescriptive. Okay, for the sake of category traps and mapping traps, because of course if you've got this huge body of work maybe, and you're sort of charting through 100 build projects or 200 project numbers or whatever, you might need this kind of gridding and mapping exercise which has a certain cognitive sort of meaning. I'm just, for this very exercise, I need ethics approval implicitly from each of you, because you will, of course, never see this again, ever again, the way you see it now. It means here you've got your say, projects scattered around, and you, of course, what you're interested in, starting to sort of map them. And here is a classic mapping exercise. You say, okay, there are some perhaps features, and so one aspect of my practice is that I'm a triangulator. Other aspects of it is that I'm obviously interested in playing the metaphor, obviously, that there may be stuff that is organized in ways in which, yes, the concept of the oval or the circles are interesting, and so you have these you map them, and these are all categories or notions in your map. Then you, after having done that, and you're sort of PRS 3 or 4, you suddenly realize there is something else hidden in this, which starts to massively capture your attention. You may even think, this is the eureka moment. I found something of extraordinary value here, which I didn't know that was hidden in my work. So you, of course, discard all the other, the previous exercises. You concentrate on this, where they call it the dancing couple or pas de deux or whatever. And so in the end, what you might start to get interested in is only that very gestalt. So the tragedy is the work goes, and you're now interested only in this kind of, the one sort of narrative, the one thing that you feel that sits there, despite the fact that, of course, this is what your body of work actually looks like. What I'm simply saying with this is, beware when you go into this process and start to and discover and find one or the other exclusive or more interesting element in it, that can, in terms of how it works on you, upon you, do extraordinary things to you, because it captures your imagination in fascinating ways. This is simply how we tick. That doesn't mean that to have explicated that very research process and to have made clear, guess what, there is a gestalt in that you wouldn't see otherwise. That may be an important and interesting contribution, of course. But beware of the spell of every single metaphor that enters the discourse. Every metaphor has that kind of gravitational force. It's a vice and a virtue. The same, of course, holds for concepts that may lead to the fly, as I showed here, to the fly being trapped in the fly bottle. This is the fly flying into the fly bottle, and doesn't know how to get out again. You know the principle of the fly bottle. I don't have to explain any of that. But here the traps of the discourse is the gravitational force of the discourse. Of course, it's also an enabling force, because with every discourse comes an extraordinary logic. It's complex, and suddenly you can make lots of things with it. That's why it's so dangerous, for example, to shift into, say, philosophical discourse of certain kind, because that has an extraordinarily powerful sort of gravitational force, and it sucks you into that, and suddenly you are juggling in extraordinary ways with sort of philosophical jargon and trying to come to terms with that. And lost is exactly in the way in which I showed you before. Lost, again, is the work that you're supposed to investigate. Of course, there's another interesting question, though, to be asked, namely, what is this discussion about discourses in relation to the research contribution that you're supposing? Because in a way you are perhaps not contributing to a specific discourse on liminality, or porosity, or whatever, because these discourses have become extraordinarily micrological. But you may say, I'm contributing to the broader discourse in my discipline. Well, one of the, I think, very interesting discourses to which you are contributing is through your methodological consideration, through that reflection on your methods and tools, is the whole discourse around design practice research, which is an emerging discourse. And it has to find its own ways to investigate what is unfolding without, again, sort of folding into all too quick jargons. Here you have another image that Richard developed, where he wants simply to show that whatever kind of discourse here, for example, you have a psychoanalytic, here this says psychoanalysis, for a researcher that should have a reflective hinge here. And whatever kind of discourse this researcher might be interested in, they must simply hang from that very central hinge, rather than the researcher gravitating out into these discourses, because of course it cannot be a contribution to psychoanalysis. We don't let a psychoanalyst examine this type of thesis. or this kind of investigation, this kind of PhD, whatever you call it in the different universities. Now, the last 5 slides, perhaps I promised you to come back to this very scenario and start to discuss with you, or perhaps invite you to consider what might be interesting for you if you are faced with this and you've done some, say, mapping around the 100 project numbers or 280 project numbers that sit here. That gives you a sense of, yes, these categories do a little bit, this lens brings that forth, in that falls through, etc. You've done all that, so you've got a sense of that, and you also have this forward scenario. Then what might be of interest is to investigate how, and this could be sort of a selective investigation, how perhaps one of the very, say, projected scenarios, one of those future scenarios that you would only reflect for, yeah, which is this last frame, how this very idea, this very hunch, relates back to the body of work that you have reflected on. And what could happen there is that this is what these little vectors try to show, at least, that of course between perhaps a select group of them a certain relation exists, and that relation might change your story about how that how those projects 15, 20 years back, how they appear to you in the light of this future work might be of a certain kind. If you look at a different project, you might also start to rearrange the very same projects differently, but also something else might happen. This is not my contribution to this, but Richard has reflected upon this in quite some detail, and he suggests that it could well be that in the light of these possibilities, maybe also a sort of an emerging project that you are reflecting in an ex eventu project, that possibilities in the past work emerge that you didn't become aware of, or that you weren't aware when you went through, when you realized those. But now, in hindsight, you can see that's another way to look at these, that as it were may spin around, yeah, and change position. You might see, yes, I can position this work in a certain way, but I can maybe also slide it around, which means in this visualization there are, as it were, unrealized possibilities also in the past work, and that may be worth exploring. Not, as it were, there is a stock of work that just needs some extraction of its relevance, but let's look at this in a dynamic way. This is not, as it were, just the received work, but this is just as dynamic as that could become dynamic. Yeah? So this is possibilities. Not all of you might think that that relates to you, but it may resonate with one or the other. Says, yes, I can see how I can use my previous body of work. Yes, this you have already seen in the morning, and I will give you a little spiel about it myself. Leon highlighted here this kind of foundation element. Yes, it sits on the spatial intelligence kind of investigation, and here you have these 3 elements. I will zoom into this because, of course, you have it also in a different document, namely this invitational poster. There you have the same, basically the same idea. What this actually, of course, brings to the discourse is 3 things that Leon has constellated, namely, I call that constellating, namely the natural history of the creative individual, and he has given you ideas about that through talking of province and metropolis and the whole dynamics of this kind of backwards and forwards idea. So this is part of a Howard Gardner story. Then here we have another important element, public behaviors. The CPRS is part of the public behavior, of course, but this is Randall Collins, who was actually interested in seeing how do little groups, small groups of individuals, how do they become so extraordinarily productive and have this, and he's done this through an investigation over, as it were, 250 years, if not 300 years of intellectual history. So this is a sociologist of intellectual change. But on here, the top element is the Boyer integrated scholarship idea, which is what, of course, you with this very PhD are eminently engaging with. Discovery, integration, application, and dissemination. Part of the dissemination story we've discussed, electronic publication, etc., all that stuff. What interests me at this very moment for you as a final idea is here is the individual domain, and here, or the individual realm, and here is the domain realm. So here we are playing in two different dimensions, which I sort of now pull up. And again, in terms of fighting close to the bull, another interesting way to look at the same thing, because again, practice-based research means almost pivoting around very important central topics, and each has a slightly different spiel, and it's important to hear those varieties. It's like different album pieces that all capture the same central square, but from different almost angles, capturing different sides to it. One of it would be, apologies for this F, fighting close to the bull is from stock authorities to communities of practice. And let me just finish off with that in the sense of there is an extraordinary tendency, of course, as soon as you seek validation, as soon as you want to somehow articulate relevance and also positioning yourself in the discipline, etc., that you start to refer to stock authorities that you think may be important to your peers. These are the usual names, the suspects, etc., all that stuff. So there is a whole stock, including, of course, the intellectual stock that you may think is important, or maybe just à la carte or en vogue, whether it's Deleuze or whether it's now the re-emerging Heidegger on place, all that stuff. Yeah? These are the stock authorities. Part of the design practice research idea is really to move away from those, because again, they have this kind of gravitational tendency to suck you into their own, say, authoritative, discursive places, and rather than that, to do two things. You can see here shedding stock authorities and finding your own authority in it, which of course has many resonances with the idea of finding your voice and being confident to pitch this with your voice in terms of this is a singular voice, it's an individual's voice, and at the same time it's the most accurate way to capture this type of research. But of course it also means not to be overly impressed by somebody else's pitches or jargon and whatever. So that goes without saying. So finding your own authority. The last question then, Vivian Mitsujani quite some time ago asked me, so how long do you actually fight the bull? Yeah? In terms of, that's an interesting question. How far do you go with this kind of reflection process? When do you imagine also the remark that I made from the sense of mastery to know where to stop, which is, by the way, also a Platonic Socratic thing. The Socratic dialogues are all interesting, not for what they say, but where they stop, yeah? Where they don't go further, so far and not a single word more. So that's a very interesting question to ask. I've thought about this a little through discussions also with Leon about meeting in horizons, and I won't go into this, but maybe there are ways in which there is a horizon in the terms of the process of fighting the bull. How many, as it were, close-up engagements do you see worthwhile? At which stage do you feel it's starting to sort of not to yield anything anymore. There may be other horizons. I won't go into the ethical horizon. But in the end, then would be no longer the bullfighting, but the bullfight that turns to flight, which is what I all wish you will happen during your candidature. By the way, this is an alternative to bullfighting that is extraordinarily acrobatic, and the real achievement of these bullfighters consists in exhibiting the most extraordinary sort of command of the body in the fight with the bull. Yeah, I've seen 3 of those so far, and I found them extraordinarily impressive. So far. Thank you very much.